Zero Books readers and viewers. It's me again, Douglas Lane, although this time, for this video, I'm filling in for Ben Burgis, who is the author of this book, Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, which you should run out and buy right away. In this video, I'll be taking on some of the arguments for a brokered or contested Democratic convention. As you may know, as Bernie Sanders has taken the lead in the U.S. Presidential nomination process in the primaries, winning Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada, the Democratic establishment has decided that it shouldn't be left up to the voters to determine who will be the Democratic nominee. It's better that they leave it to the wise people who are part of the super friends. The super delegates. So the first argument for letting the super friends or super delegates decide the vote is an argument about Bernie Sanders' hypocrisy. Since Bernie Sanders wrote the rules for the primary process, since he and his team were responsible for allowing the superdelegates to have a say at the Democratic convention, he must now live with the consequences of those rules. He must stick by his own rules. The other thing that they argue is that in 2016, it was Bernie Sanders who wanted to overturn the will of the primary voters by going into the Democratic convention with his own delegates and trying to broker a deal so that he would become the nominee, despite the fact that Hillary was way ahead. Now, in fact, Bernie Sanders didn't write the rules that the Democrats are following now, but what he did was try to get rid of the superdelegates. I guess it was some committee, the Rules Committee or something like that, that his team was a part of, and they advocated to leave it up to the voters, to let the primary voters decide who the nominee would be, and to do away with the superdelegates. And the DNC's response was to push for superdelegate participation. What came out of that was a compromise where the superdelegates wouldn't get a vote on the first round at the convention, but would have to be held back until the second round. This is sort of a halfway measure. And it's turning out now not to be quite enough to really forestall an attempt to rig or steal the nomination. Now, what Burgis points out in his article is that this argument about Sanders writing the rules and therefore having to live with them is about as logical as an argument against a union representative in a similar situation. So like if a union representative were negotiating with management about a pay increase and he was trying to push for a big pay hike, and out of the negotiation process a much more moderate wage increase was determined, you wouldn't call him a hypocrite for later down the line that union representative still advocating for a larger increase in pay for the workers. It's not that he's being hypocritical in that case. He's still following the same exact argument or trajectory as he was before. He's simply taking up his side of the argument again. And that's what Bernie Sanders would be doing or is doing when he says that the voters should decide who the nominee for the Democratic Party is going to be. So the charge of hypocrisy when it comes to following the rules is just a non-starter. It's counterfactual. It's made probably in bad faith. Furthermore, in 2016, Bernie Sanders did not argue for letting the superdelegates decide who the nominee would be. Instead, what he argued was that the contest as it had been run up to a certain point, like before he went to California, showed that the delegate count was fairly even, but the superdelegate count was wildly out of whack. So what he wanted was for the superdelegates who had endorsed Hillary Clinton in states that Bernie Sanders had won to switch their votes to support Bernie Sanders in line with the popular vote in those states. When he won a majority of the votes, say in Michigan, he wanted those superdelegates in the state to go with the will of the majority of voters in the state and support him. The idea was it was a close enough contest between Clinton and Bernie, at least up until a certain point, that it made sense to try to contest the results in the convention, especially when the superdelegate count had such an impact on the course of the race. Not only were those superdelegates going to get to vote right away in the first round at the convention, but also they were being reported as votes, as totals from the very beginning of the nominating process. So it looked as though when you just saw the stats on the screens of televisions that Hillary Clinton was way, way ahead of Bernie Sanders, even though in terms of actual delegates, it was very, very close. Basically, elite opinion was being taken into account in the 2016 race and really, I think, helped Clinton secure the nomination in a way that was rather unfair. The other thing that happened in 2016 was that the DNC collaborated with or coordinated with the Clinton campaign in a way that violated their own rules, and they were not at all impartial mediators or administrators of the primary elections, but were in the tank for Hillary Clinton. And this has come out in books and articles and from the players themselves. Donna Brazile has said that the DNC rigged the primary process for Hillary Clinton and against Bernie Sanders. So to talk about Bernie Sanders' hypocrisy is a mistake, but I think you can talk about the consistency of the DNC and their desire to rig the primary process against Bernie Sanders. Finally, Burgis points out in his essay that even if Bernie Sanders has changed his position, even if Bernie Sanders wanted to go into a contested convention in 2016 and get help from superdelegates and others to take the nomination away from Hillary Clinton and take it up for himself, even if he did that or was trying to do that in 2016, that doesn't settle the question of what the moral or democratic approach to selecting a nominee would actually be. It doesn't justify the DNC's position to point out that their opponent may not be morally perfect. In fact, the question of what the right way to nominate a presidential candidate is can't be determined by examining the character or the hypocrisy of either side of the debate. That's a kind of ad hominem argument to point to the hypocrisy of your opponent. The question stands on its own. What is the proper way to nominate a presidential candidate? What is the democratic way? And it's pretty clear that the best way would be to go with the will of the voters, to count the votes and see who wins. Now, probably the best argument for letting the superdelegates intervene and determine who the nominee would be that the different candidates in the race represent different ideological positions. Basically, there is the Bernie lane, which is, let's call it the social democratic, radical reformist lane of the contest. And then there's the centrist or moderate lane, which would be everybody else. And if you take that perspective, then all the votes for Pete Buttigieg or Amy Klobuchar or Elizabeth Warren or Michael Bloomberg or Joe Biden or Tom Steyer or Andrew Yang, all of them are actually the same. That they're all equivalent to each other. So a vote for Biden is a vote for Warren, is a vote for Klobuchar. And that means that the will of the people won't be really enacted unless you add up all the votes from the non-Bernie lane and consider the weight of those votes as one voting block as opposed to Bernie's voting block. And if that's the case, then it would fall upon the superdelegates to step in and make sure that the will of the people is heard and that the will of the people is enacted, and to select one of those other candidates, or anyone really who isn't Bernie, to be the nominee. However, there are a couple of problems with this argument. The first is that there's really no evidence at all that the voters are considering their votes in terms of ideological lanes. If you poll them, you'll find that, for instance, a Joe Biden voter is as likely to list Bernie Sanders as their second choice, in fact, more likely to list Bernie Sanders as their second choice as they are, say, to list Amy Klobuchar or Pete Buttigieg or Mike Bloomberg as their second choice. So the real way to test whether or not there would be these ideological lanes, whether or not voters are thinking about the policies of the different candidates as representing different ideological or political stances, would be to run instant runoff elections. Let them say directly who they would prefer to have as their second choice, who they think is closest to their preferred candidate if he doesn't win. And that's how it works in caucuses to a large extent, and it's also how it works in European elections or some European elections. It might be a good way for it to work here, but it doesn't work that way here. And letting the superdelegates just decide for the voters who their second choice would be is no solution at all. It's just an imposition of the ideas of the ruling class onto the voters. It's just really a way to steal it from Bernie Sanders. The third and final argument for letting the superdelegates decide who will be the Democratic nominee would be a kind of pragmatic argument based on the perception of who is the most electable. So the idea is, well, sure, the liberal, leftist, rank-and-file Democratic Party voters might prefer Bernie Sanders, but they're not being smart. In fact, in a general election, when it's including independents and Republican voters, Bernie Sanders is weak for ideological reasons. His approach to politics might fit with the majority of the rank and file of the Democratic Party, but it is going to be a failure when it comes to the general election. Therefore, it is only responsible for the superdelegates to step in and correct the will of the public. And they have to negate the votes of their own rank and file, because they're basically philosopher kings. They understand what is the best strategic choice, and it's a moral imperative to beat Donald Trump, who, after all, is kind of a creeping or crypto or proto-fascist. So in this case, the rules of the Democratic Party, the rules of democracy, have to be overturned because it's an emergency. The problem with that is that there's no evidence that Bernie Sanders is the weaker candidate against Donald Trump. All the evidence that there is, the polls, for instance, shows that Bernie Sanders is the strongest candidate against Donald Trump. Not by a huge margin, but nonetheless, he outperforms any other candidate when polled in a head-to-head with Donald Trump. Further, the fact that Sanders has been winning state after state, with the exception of South Carolina recently, is itself another test of the electability of Bernie Sanders. If you want to know who is most likely to win an election, you might look to see who's been winning, especially when you consider that some of the primary states include independents. So if you want to know who's going to win over independents in the general, look to those states that include independents in the primary process. Finally, I just want to say that when I think about the prospect of a contested Democratic convention, I have mixed feelings. As a Marxist of a type, as a left communist Marxist, or someone who wants to see a revolutionary change, I have this sort of natural inclination to desire chaos amongst the establishment. But on the other hand, the socialist left as it is isn't really prepared to take advantage of that crack up. It's really unclear as to what the consequences of that destruction of the Democratic Party would be. And I have to say, I kind of like Bernie Sanders. I mean, I can't fully justify the depths of my feelings for Bernie, but I have to confess, as I watch this unfold, I'm becoming more and more of a Bernie bro, against my better judgment, maybe. So all I can say for certain is that if there is a contested convention, well, there will be chaos. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.